you serious? The same way they got there. The Lord directed them there, and the Lord brought them back. That's assuming that they were even living in Australia at the time, because this, according to the scriptures, was toward the beginning of civilization. Think of it this way. You can ridicule Christians all you want as if we're stupid for believing the Bible. But I don't see the rationale in believing that we came from one single cell, and that's how all life came about. I don't care how simple you try to make it. I tell you what, here's my thought. Until you can get a kit that you can buy at some store, go to a university with the perfect conditions in the science lab, and create life in that single cell, and then that single cell can reproduce on its own, you will not show any credibility to me that I will take seriously, because it's a lot more rational to think that someone with intelligence created us with the complications of life and to reproduce than to believe it just happened.
If the ark was covered in pitch or tar to make it watertight, it also made it airtight. How did the animals survive more than 1 or 2 days living in complete darkness without any fresh air? Remember, the rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights. Noah couldn't open the window in the top.
In Genesis chapter 6 verse 16 from the Living Translation, it says, construct a skylight all the way around the ship 18 inches below the roof. The Message translation says build a roof for it and put a window 18 inches from the top. So it was a huge window. Now I went to look up in my Bible Customs handbook to see about windows, and I bet it didn't occur to the author of this video that glass windows did not exist in Noah's time. In fact, here's a quote that will clear up the matter in order to answer what is claimed that a Christian can't answered. Quote, glass for windows was unknown, so large openings were barred with wood. Page 16 from the book, The Way It Was in Bible Times. So even though Noah waited 40 days and 40 nights before he opened the window, Genesis 8:6, there was plenty of air and light available. Here is a picture of a common window in ancient times to clarify the meaning of the Genesis account. So it's not the Christian that can't answer that's the issue, but the one that trusts in his modern thinking of how the ancient world lived is the issue.
Since Adam and Eve didn't know right from wrong before eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, why did God then punish them for something they didn't understand they were doing?
Simple. There was only one thing that they did understand, that if they ate from the forbidden tree, they would die. So man knew what he did and that the punishment was death, for it was explicitly spelled out. So what part of no do you not understand?
Why would God place a forbidden tree in the garden so close to his innocent creation and allow Satan to tempt them into eating from it, all the while looking on without doing a thing to prevent it?
If God intervened, then man would simply be a robot and have no free will. As a parent, I would not want to have my kid that never disobeyed me, but at the same time never loved me. I'd rather have a kid, though he makes mistakes and has shortcomings, just like I have, but would surprise me out of love to do something special for me. If that is the way it is with the parent and the child, then why would you think it'd be differently with the creator of the universe? After all, the Bible says, for God so loved the world. How many parents realize that there is a point where they have to let their kids make their own mistakes and continue to love them through their mistakes and shortcomings? Second, don't forget we are responsible for our own actions. Here's an illustration to help you out. Suppose God's in a helicopter up in the mountains. He's looking down on this curvy road. There's a big truck that's coming around the bend. It lost its brakes. As it goes around the corner, there's a brand new Corvette coming head on. The person in the helicopter is not the one at fault, but the Corvette driver for driving too fast. The person in the helicopter can see afar off, but we are responsible for our own actions. Finally, God has done something by sending Jesus to the cross, but we choose our path and no one else.
When the women went to Jesus' empty tomb, was the stone already rolled away, or did an angel roll it away after the women got there?
The short answer is the stone was already rolled away before the women got there. John's gospel, the focus is on Mary. Luke's gospel, the focus was on the women that were come to anoint his body. However, in Mark's gospel, the focus was on a conversation that the women had on their way to the tomb. This is key to the timeline of the angel rolling back the stone. Mark chapter 16 verses 3 and 4 says, and on the way, we're discussing how they could ever roll aside the huge stone from the entrance. But when they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, a very heavy one, was already moved away and the entrance was open. So John, Luke, and Mark records that the stone was already rolled away when the women looked at the tomb and the entrance was open. However, when we go to Matthew, we see that he will focus on how this whole event happened. In chapter 28, verse 1, it says, early on Sunday morning, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went out to the tomb. So folks, this means they were en route to the gravesite. Now, you need to think this through because it would take a certain amount of time to go from their homes to the gravesite, and it would probably be dark as recorded in the Gospel of John when they started. Their minds were fixed on who would roll away the stone according to Mark's Gospel. This is such a critical piece of information that I think people just kind of skip over it. Since it would be the beginning of sunrise, there was still not a lot of light. It would be sometime before they came close enough in the little sunlight before they can really get a good look at the tomb. Matthew chapter 28 verse 2 says, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And now the next part of the verse gives the reason for the earthquake. For the angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. But the next verse is the second critical part in order to understand the timing of the angel who rolled back the stone. Matthew 28 verse 4 says, the guards shook with fear when they saw him and fell into a dead faint. So by this verse, we know that those standing guard fainted. So why is this all important? Because at first glance, it may seem that the woman got there and then the angel came, rolled away the stone, and the guards fainted. But this is not really the case, and I'm going to go over this. In Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66, the chief priests asked Pilate that be a stone on the entrance of the tomb and a seal. The reason was this. The guards need to guard for 3 days, so his disciples could not steal away the body and claim that he rose again, because that's what Jesus had claimed he would do. So, here are Roman guards stationed there. And in Mark's gospel, it tells of a conversation that the women had on the way to the tomb. When the women said, who shall roll away the stone? Man, a red flag just went off in my mind. Apparently, the women did not know that they would be Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, or else they would have been saying, how do we convince the guards to roll away the stone? Keep that in mind. Second, this earthquake and the angel rolling away the stone was so dramatic that Rome's finest military fainted. You want me to believe that this dramatic event happened to the guards, but that these women were not even struck by it? We're fine? That's a real stretch, to say the least. Finally, you got to understand that their focus was on the tomb, and they were so caught up in that the stone was rolled away that the men that had already fainted, either the women did not notice they were fainted, or they were so caught up looking for the body of Jesus, they didn't even bother to text Pilate on what happened, because their focus was on the body of Jesus. Now, here's the point I need to drive home. If the angel rolled away the stone after they got there, then from the time the women got there to the time that the angel came, if that was the case, wouldn't they have at least had a conversation A, with the guards to see if they can get to the body of Jesus and anoint it, or if not, wouldn't they have talked among themselves about the guards and what to do concerning the situation if at some point the stone was not yet rolled away? See, Mark's gospel proves that they were talking about rolling away the stone on their way. And if the stone was still over the entrance of the tomb, they would have continued talking about it. To me, the angel came before the women did, and the guards fainted. The angel rolled away the stone and sat upon it. When the women finally got there, they saw the stone rolled away and the angel sitting on it. Had this event not happened yet, there would have been something said about the women and the guards either interacting or the women trying to figure out what to do in order to talk to the guards concerning what mission they were on. And thus, to me, this proves that the angel rolled back the stone before the woman even looked at the tomb.
On the first day of the week, when Jesus rose from the dead, how many women went to the tomb, and which ones?
Several. The gospel writers mention 4 out of the several that went to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna. Since Luke's gospel mentions a few of them plus several others, then several went to the tomb. Which ones went is still several. Luke 24:10 from the Living Translation says, "The women who went to the tomb were Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and several others." Very simple.
If you believe the creation account in Genesis is mere allegory, then why don't you throw out Paul's epistles? Because he believed that the creation account was a historical fact.
I believe it was real. Even Jesus referred to it as a fact. In fact, referring to one of the children of Adam and Eve was Abel. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 35, Jesus states from the King James that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth from the blood of righteous Abel. Consider the creation account, and Jesus also quotes Genesis. From Mark chapter 10, verses 6 through 9. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this cause shall man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but they are one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. So I not only believe the Apostle Paul on creation, but what Jesus himself stated.
How many donkeys did Jesus ride in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem? Was it one donkey, like Mark, Luke, and John say? Or was it 2 donkeys, like Matthew said?
Well, no matter how you look at it, Mark, Luke, and John all state that Jesus gave explicit instructions to go to the village, and when you find a young donkey, untie him and bring him to me. However, when we look at Matthew, he explicitly states the ass and the colt. But I don't believe this is a contradiction. First, let's read the text. It states the following: saying unto them, go into the village over against you, and straightway ye shall find an ass tied, and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them unto me. If any man say aught unto you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and straightway he will send them. All this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, tell ye the daughter of Zion, behold, thy king cometh unto thee, meek and sitting upon an ass, and on a colt, the foal of an ass. And the disciples went and did as Jesus commanded them, and brought the ass and the colt, and put on them their clothes, and they set him thereon. The intention of Jesus was to ride on a young colt as a sign of submission. Yet why would Matthew clearly mention 2 and all the other Gospels only 1? It's actually quite simple. Jesus would ride the young colt, but since never a man sat on it, like Mark and Luke's Gospel state, the mother would be needed, not for Jesus' sake, but for the sake of the young colt that did not experience a person riding on him. And that's the reason why I'm bringing this up, because that kind of animal, that animal had to trust you before it would allow you to ride them. And the only way that can really happen is have the mother nearby to show that it'd be okay. Now, notice the young colt is a he, but the ass is a she, as a mother will be with their young child the first day of school. So why would it be any different in the animal kingdom? Thus, I believe the mother began the journey with Jesus on it, and the colt finish it. That is the reason why you would need 2 donkeys for the sake of the colt, because it has never done it before, and the mother would be there to reassure. Okay, so you're saying, okay, but still, isn't there a contradiction? Actually, no. Listen carefully. I believe Jesus told them where to find the colt and to bring them back to him. However, since Mark and Luke state whereon no man sat, then that saying would give meaning to the readers of these gospels that we simply don't have. I mean, when's the last time you rode on a donkey? Or how many people do you know ride on a donkey? So we cannot relate to them the way the readers of the gospel would relate to this particular saying. To Mark, Luke, and John, it wasn't a big deal because their focus was on the Messiah. Okay, hang in there now. For they knew a young colt would need its mom. That was an understanding. You know, my kids bought their mom a brand new pair of boots for Christmas. If they said, make sure you bring your boots to church Sunday, then their mom would assume that they meant for her to wear them to church and not just to carry them. So that saying had a certain meaning then, and because we are detached from it, we're not getting the full meaning. So the readers of that day would know what is meant by whereon never a man sat, just like we would know when someone says to you, just Google it. Now, Matthew, you should know this by now, is giving additional information, just like we read about the story of the angel rolling away the stone, gives us more information. And thus, that is why Jesus said, bring the ass and the colt to me. For Matthew would convey that part of the conversation for a good reason. You see, think about it. Jesus said, get the colt, and I'm sure the disciples go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hey, what happens if the mother's nearby? It's going to give us a problem. Then bring the ass and the colt to me. But we don't see that recorded. But there wasn't a need to record it because there was an understanding there already. And also remember that Matthew was an eyewitness to the actual event, but not necessarily the others. Once Jesus rode the mother, then the young colt would begin to trust. Jesus started on the mother, and then Jesus would ride into Jerusalem, as the scripture says, on the colt. Remember, they started the journey at the Mount of Olives, so it's some pretty hilly terrain to go down. The young colt would not be used to that. Finally, here's a quote on training donkeys that could really help concerning this matter. Quote, sometimes a lot of patience is needed, especially to overcome the first barrier, the donkey's unfamiliarity with the human touch and voice. Unless it's a newborn where everything would be unfamiliar to it, and it will react as its mother does. In addition, the presence of any other well-trained donkey makes it much easier to train a new one. There is no doubt that donkeys learn as much from each other as they do from humans. Unlike other working animals, a donkey does not give its best effort and behavior to a person that it respects, but to the one that it trusts and likes. It is therefore the owner's best interest to get the donkey's trust and liking. This could take time, but after that, everything is remarkable easy, end quote. I think the author of this video has assumed too much. Let's just say to assume can make you look like, well, you can fill in the blank.
Matthew and Luke both provide genealogies for Jesus, going all the way back to Adam. Using both of those lists, who was Joseph's father?
I want to clarify something for the listeners. Matthew's list goes only back to Abraham, not Adam. whereas Luke goes back to Adam. Now, these lists were very simple. They mostly consist of a father and of an important son whom he begot. However, when looking at these lists, there is a very important exception. How do you list a stepfather? Also, how do you list a person born through a woman without a natural man? That's why there may seem to be a contradiction, but there really isn't. Second, the Messiah would have to be a descendant of King David. What these lists do is list the descendants of Jesus after the flesh. However, one will show the ancestry list from King David's son Solomon, but the other list will be David's other son, Nathan. So, Joseph is a true descendant of King David. However, there was a man recorded in Matthew 1:11 that was cursed in the ancestry of King Solomon that would result in no descendants of that man would sit on King David's throne. And that is the line of Joseph. His father was Jacob, Matthew 1:16. Notice the careful wording of the King James concerning Jesus. Matthew 1:16, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Christ, Jesus, who is called Christ. Thus, it's not Joseph that begot Christ, but Joseph was the husband of Mary, of whom it would be called Christ. However, in Luke's account, instead of Solomon's line, it would be the line of Nathan, Luke 3:21. This is the line that Mary came from, whose father was Heli. And that's what's so important. It was normally not the mother that begot, it was the father that begot. So that's what Luke does in this particular situation. And notice the careful wording of the text. And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being as was supposed the son of Joseph. He actually wasn't son of Joseph, he was more of a stepson, which was the son of Heli. As was supposed is the key. The seed normally was spoken of after a man and his ancestry. However, there is a notable exception, for after the fall, Eve was told that the Messiah in Genesis 3:15 would come through her seed. Since women were not the carrier of the seed, the wording is different to compensate for this exception. And the readers of Luke and the readers of Matthew would understand this. We may not, because we don't follow ancestry trail like they did, and it was of such importance. That's why we are to study the scriptures in order to understand them correctly.
Was Jesus crucified on the first day of Passover like the Gospel of John says, or the next day like the other three Gospels say?
Actually, there's only one day of Passover, but there are 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the Jewish day was different than our day because it went from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. So when 6 p.m. came, it was the new day. So, for example, the Passover lamb was to be killed at 3 p.m. on the 14th day of the Jewish month Nisan in order to eat the meal for 6 p.m., which would begin the next day, the 15th. Now, the Passover was also called the Day of Preparation. Quote, Passover, the 14th, was the preparation day for the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Page 67, celebrating Jesus in the biblical feast. See, it was getting things ready for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but it happened before the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the exact timing of Jesus' death by crucifixion. What that means in layman's terms is the Passover is the preparation day, and that is the day that Jesus was crucified and died at 3 p.m. Matthew 27:46 from the Amplified says, and about the 9th hour, 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, and then a few verses later died. So just as a lamb was slain at 3 p.m., so Jesus died at that time. Mark 15:42 from the Amplified says, as evening had already come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. So again, Jesus was crucified on the day of Passover, before the Sabbath. However, this is not the weekly Sabbath, but a special Sabbath, which leads to confusion on this issue. And unless you study the feast as I have, you will be clueless on this. I have two great books I recommend. One of them is Celebrating Jesus in the Biblical Feasts, and the other one is The Feast of the Lord. Both are great books, and they really give you good insight into the scriptures. Luke chapter 23, let's look at verse 46, and then we're going to skip down to 54. It says, "And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And with these words he expired." Verse 54, it states, "It was the day of preparation for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was drawing or approaching." Again, this is a special Sabbath and not the weekly Sabbath. So I want to see if this could sink in for you guys. The Passover lamb was to be slain at 3 p.m. on Passover, which is called the Day of Preparation. And that's the time that Jesus died and became the Passover lamb. Now, when we go to the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 30 and 31, and I'm quoting all from the Amplified, states, "When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, 'It is finished.' He bowed his head and gave up his spirit." Since it was the day of preparation, in order to prevent the bodies from hanging on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a very solemn and important one, the Jews requested Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. That Sabbath was not the weekly Sabbath, but the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would start the next day on the 15th. So 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus dies. And they only had about 3 hours to take his body down, because that would begin the special Sabbath at 6 p.m. And when the new day would start, which was the 15th, they would celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In fact, let me quote it from Leviticus, from where it's taken from the Living Translation. Leviticus 23:6 states the following: "The festival of unleavened bread, this is to be celebrated beginning the day following the Passover. And for 7 days you must not eat any bread made with yeast. On the first day of this festival you shall gather the people for worship, and all ordinary work shall cease." So we could see it's a Sabbath. "You shall do the same on the 7th day of the festival. On each of the intervening days you shall make an offering by fire to the Lord." See, it's easy to look for contradictions in the Bible. That doesn't require much work. And the internet's kind of like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to find it. However, to meditate on His Word takes a lot more work, but it's well worth it. Though the author of this video meant to cast doubt on the Bible, I'm glad that I found the video. Once again, let God be true and every man a liar. But finally, I want to leave a verse for the author of this video, taken from the Living Translations. Proverbs 18:17 says this: "Any story sounds true until someone tells the other side and sets the record straight."